Somewhere in the outer spiral arm of the galaxy, where sensible species had established a research station far enough from death worlds to sleep soundly at night, an incident report landed on Administrator Vecthor's desk that made his 3 eye stalks cross involuntarily. The Zenith Research Station prided itself on according to YouTube analytics, 98% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Technical precision, methodical documentation, and an extremely boring safety record. Vecthor liked boring. Boring meant nobody was screaming, bleeding, or filing insurance claims for lost limbs. This report was not boring. Medical emergency involving human researcher and unauthorized fauna. Section 7 Beta. Immediate response required. Read like the opening line of a horror novel, which, considering humans were involved, probably wasn't far from the truth. The thing about humans that nobody told you at the Galactic Integration seminars was how spectacularly they ignored every survival instinct evolution supposedly gifted them. The seminars mentioned their death world origin, certainly. They touched on the alarming durability, the persistence hunting, the binocular predator vision. What they failed to mention was the human's baffling compulsion to adopt anything with teeth as though it were a harmless blob of affection waiting to happen. Vecthor had been warned about the human xenobiologist when she first applied to the station. Her credentials were impeccable, her research proposals fascinating, her references glowing. Then someone mentioned she had previously worked on Earth studying something called wolf behavior, and had been forcibly removed from her field site after attempting to join a pack. The review board had debated for 3 cycles before approving her assignment, mostly because her expertise in predator social structures was genuinely unmatched, and partly because refusing a human application meant filling out 17 additional forms explaining why you were discriminating against Deathworlders. She arrived at Zenith Station 6 months ago with an enthusiasm that made the other researchers nervous, and a smile that suggested she knew exactly how nervous she made them. Her assigned project involved studying the Carthian Ridge Prowlers, apex predators from a world that made Earth look like a vacation resort. These creatures stood shoulder height with most humans, possessed retractable claws that could shred plasteel, and demonstrated pack-hunting intelligence that rivaled some spacefaring species. Their cubs, naturally, were considered extremely dangerous from the moment they opened their eyes. Somehow, the human had convinced the ethics board that raising 4 Prowler cubs in a controlled environment would provide invaluable data about predator socialization and intelligence development. The fact that she would be the primary caretaker seemed like a minor detail she mentioned almost as an afterthought during the approval hearing. Vecthor had voted against the proposal. He was outvoted by scientists who apparently found the concept of publishable research more compelling than their own mortality. For 5 months, the arrangement proceeded with suspicious smoothness. The human researcher maintained meticulous records, provided fascinating behavioral observations, and seemed to possess an uncanny ability to read the cubs' moods and intentions. The cubs, for their part, grew rapidly from 15-pound bundles of claws into 80-pound bundles of significantly more claws. Security footage showed them following the human around their habitat with the kind of focused attention predators typically reserved for prey, except their body language suggested something else entirely, something that made xenopsychologists very uncomfortable when they reviewed the tapes. "They've imprinted on her," one Trillian researcher observed during a review meeting, his translator struggling with a mixture of scientific fascination and existential horror in his voice. That's not supposed to be possible with Prowlers. They're obligate pack hunters with extremely rigid social hierarchies. An alien species shouldn't register as pack family. And yet, the human had responded cheerfully during her weekly report. Here we are. Here they were indeed. The cubs, now 5 months old and entering their juvenile phase, displayed pack cohesion that would make adult prowlers envious. They coordinated movements with silent precision, shared food according to a hierarchy only they understood, and most disturbingly, treated the human as though she occupied some role in that hierarchy. Not prey, not threat. Something their instincts shouldn't have had a category for, yet clearly did. The trouble started on a Tuesday, because of course it did. Tuesdays had a reputation across the galaxy for going sideways, and this one upheld that tradition with impressive commitment. The human had been conducting her usual morning routine, running the cubs through enrichment exercises that looked suspiciously like training them for coordinated ambush tactics. Observers noted she seemed slightly off, moving with less energy than usual, but attributed it to fatigue. Humans had a well-documented tendency to ignore their own physical limitations in favor of completing tasks, a trait that had led to a station-wide mandatory rest period policy specifically for the human staff members. By midday, the situation had deteriorated noticeably. The human cut the training session short and retreated to the observation room adjacent to the cub's habitat, which doubled as her workspace. The cubs followed naturally, because leaving their pack member alone was apparently not in their programming. Security cameras showed her sitting at her desk, attempting to review data logs while occasionally pressing her hand against her forehead in the universal gesture of, "Something is very wrong, but I'm going to pretend it's fine." The cubs noticed. Of course they noticed. Predators with million-year evolutionary lineages built on reading the slightest signs of weakness in potential prey weren't about to miss obvious distress signals from someone they decided was family. Their behavior shifted within minutes. The playful roughhousing stopped. The exploratory wandering ceased. All 4 cubs arranged themselves in a loose perimeter around the human's chair, their eyes tracking every movement she made with an intensity that would have been terrifying under different circumstances. When she stood up unsteadily and moved toward the habitat's rest area, they moved with her, maintaining their positions with the kind of coordinated precision that took adult Prowler packs years to develop. The human made it to the rest platform before her legs apparently decided they were done cooperating. She collapsed onto the cushioned surface with less grace than humans typically managed, and that's when the cubs made their decision. They closed ranks. 4 juvenile prowlers, each weighing more than the human and armed with natural weapons that could inflict fatal injuries with casual swipes, formed a defensive circle around her prone form. Their ears flattened against their skulls, their tails held low and still, their eyes fixed on the doorway with an expression that transcended species barriers and translated clearly into any language. Approach at your own risk. This was the situation when the station's medical AI flagged the human's biometric readings as critical and dispatched a medical team to Section 7 Beta. This was also when Administrator Vector realized that his boring job had just become significantly less boring, and that somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of galactic administration, there was definitely not a protocol for medical emergency patient guarded by loyal predator cubs who view medical personnel as potential threats. The first responder team arrived at the habitat entrance within 4 minutes of the alert, which was excellent response time and would have been commendable under normal circumstances. They carried standard emergency equipment, followed all proper procedures, and were completely unprepared for what waited on the other side of the transparent barrier. 4 sets of predator eyes locked onto them with the kind of focus usually reserved for hunting. Low, rumbling growls that humans would probably describe as adorable, but that every other species correctly interpreted as warning, violence imminent, filled the habitat. The cubs didn't move from their positions, but their muscles tensed in a way that suggested movement would happen very quickly if the barrier opened. Behind them, barely visible through the defensive wall of fur and claws, the human lay motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest. The medical team leader, a Vorian with 2 decades of emergency response experience, stared at the scene with the expression of someone reassessing their career choices. She tapped her communicator with one of her 4 hands while the other 3 held her, scanner and medical kit. "Administrator Vector," she said, her voice carrying the careful calm of a professional delivering bad news. "We have a situation." "Define situation," Vector responded, though he was already pulling up the habitat cameras on his terminal and regretting it immediately. "The human requires immediate medical intervention. She's displaying symptoms consistent with Rigelian fever, probably contracted from the contaminated shipment that arrived last week. Without treatment, her condition will deteriorate rapidly. The medical team leader paused, watching one of the cubs shift its weight and bare its teeth at the barrier. However, the patient is currently under guard by 4 extremely protective predators who appear to believe we represent a threat. Can you sedate them? Not without opening the barrier, which they're clearly guarding. And even if we could, sedating all 4 simultaneously before they react would require precision we can't guarantee. Prowler cubs at this age have reflexes that make our response time look glacial. Vecthor's eye stalks drooped, a Therian gesture equivalent to a heavy sigh. So what you're telling me is that we have a critically ill human who needs immediate medical care, but we can't reach her because she's being protected by the very creatures she's been studying, and those creatures can't comprehend that we're trying to help. That is an accurate summary of our situation, yes. And the human herself can't call them off? The medical officer checked her scanner readings. She's semi-conscious at best. Fever is spiking rapidly. Rigelian fever progresses fast in humans due to their elevated metabolism. We have maybe 2 hours before organ damage becomes irreversible. This was, Vecthor reflected, exactly the kind of scenario that made him vote against the Prowler Cub project in the first place. Though in fairness, he hadn't imagined this specific disaster. His predictions had involved the cubs escaping and hunting other researchers, not loyally defending their adopted human packmate from medical assistance. Keep the team ready, he said finally. I'm contacting our xenopsychology department. If we can't go through the cubs, maybe we can negotiate with them. Sir, they're animals. They're animals who have demonstrated complex social bonding, coordinated tactical thinking, and apparently, loyalty that transcends species barriers. Let's see if intelligence goes with the package. As Vecthor terminated the connection and began scrolling through the station's expert directory, he couldn't help but notice the irony. Humanity had spent centuries proving they could survive anything the universe threw at them. They'd climbed to the top of their death world food chain through stubbornness and impossible endurance. They'd reached the stars through sheer determination and concerning disregard for safety margins. And now, one of them might die because the predators she'd befriended were too loyal to let anyone save her life. That, Vecthor thought as he initiated a station-wide page for xenopsychology specialists, was the most human problem he'd ever encountered. Dr. Melthar arrived at Section 7 Beta with the weary expression of someone who'd already had 3 impossible consultations before breakfast and was anticipating a 4th. The Quellan physician had 16 years of emergency medicine experience across 12 species, including 2 years specifically dedicated to treating humans after that incident with the mining colony and the improvised surgery involving a plasma cutter. Humans, he'd learned, were medically fascinating in the way that active volcanoes were geologically interesting, from a significant distance. "Show me," he said simply, and the medical team parted to give him a clear view through the transparent barrier. The scene hadn't improved. If anything, the cubs looked more agitated, their low growls forming a continuous rumble that vibrated through the floor. The human's biometric readings painted an increasingly grim picture on his scanner. Temperature climbing, blood pressure dropping, respiratory rate accelerating. Classic Rigelian fever progression. And they were losing time. "Has anyone attempted communication?" Melthar asked. "With the cubs?" The medical team leader's tone suggested she thought he'd been exposed to something hallucinogenic. "They're animals. They're animals demonstrating complex protective behavior and coordinated strategy," Melthar corrected, studying the cub's positioning. "That suggests cognitive processing beyond simple instinct. The human researcher spent 5 months teaching them behavioral responses. Perhaps she taught them more than we realized." He approached the barrier slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. 4 pairs of eyes tracked him with predatory precision. One cub, slightly larger than the others, took a half-step forward, positioning itself between Melthar and the human, a warning that couldn't have been clearer if it came with written instructions. "Easy," Melthar said softly, though he knew they couldn't understand his language. But tone, body language, those were universal. Nobody here wants to hurt your pack member. We're trying to help her. The lead cub's ears twitched. Not much, barely noticeable. But Melthar had spent enough time studying predator behavior to recognize a response when he saw one. The creature was listening, evaluating, thinking. Behind the defensive line, the human stirred slightly, a small moan escaping her lips. Immediately, all 4 cubs shifted, their attention snapping to her before returning to the perceived threats outside their circle. The message was obvious. She was vulnerable, and they weren't moving. "We need a new approach," Melthar announced, stepping back from the barrier. "If we can't go through them, we go around them. Or better yet, we make them want to let us through." Melthar spent exactly 7 minutes reviewing every piece of footage the station had recorded of the human and her cubs over the past 5 months. 7 minutes that they couldn't afford, but also couldn't do without. What he saw confirmed his suspicion. The cubs weren't just domesticated predators following conditioning. They'd learned, actually learned with comprehension that bordered on unsettling. The human used hand signals, specific gestures for specific commands: sit, stay, come, back away. Simple enough for animal training, except the footage showed more complex exchanges. The cubs responding to sequences of gestures, anticipating commands based on context, even initiating what looked disturbingly like requests for attention or play, using their own body language that the human clearly understood. Two-way communication. Rudimentary, absolutely, but present. "Get me a feed into that habitat," Melthar ordered. "Audio and visual, and someone find her training logs. I need to know every signal she taught them." 15 minutes later, armed with a crash course in human Prowler sign language that made his head hurt, Melthar stood at the barrier again. The human's condition had worsened visibly. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that, even accounting for species differences, looked bad. Time was running out in the way that medical professionals dreaded, quietly and quickly. He raised his hands slowly, positioning them where all 4 cubs could see. The gesture for friend, according to the human's notes, a circular motion followed by both palms facing outward. The cubs watched but didn't react beyond the lead one tilting its head slightly, an almost quizzical expression crossing its alien features. Melthar tried again, this time combining it with the gesture for help. The cubs shifted, their growls lowering in pitch but not stopping. Not quite aggression, not quite acceptance. Negotiation territory, if he was reading this correctly. Behind them, the human coughed weakly. The sound galvanized all 4 cubs into high alert, their focus snapping between her and the barrier with visible distress. They knew something was wrong. Of course they knew. Predators that sophisticated could smell illness, could sense weakness. What they couldn't understand was that the people outside the barrier were trying to fix it. "Listen," Melthar said, keeping his voice low and steady, continuing the hand gestures even as he spoke. "I know you can't understand all of this, but you're smart enough to know she's sick. Sick means she needs help. Help means medicine. Medicine means letting me in there." The lead cub made a sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whine. Uncertainty, maybe, or warning. Hard to tell with species whose emotional vocabulary differed so dramatically from anything Melthar usually treated. Then he had an idea. Possibly brilliant, probably insane, definitely unauthorized. He pulled out a medical injector, holding it up where the cubs could see. Then, very deliberately, he pressed it against his own arm and triggered the mechanism. The hiss of the injection made all 4 cubs tense, but Melthar stood still, showing no pain, no distress. He held up the empty injector, then gestured toward the human with what he desperately hoped they'd interpret as, "Same thing, will help." The lead cub stared at him for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, deliberately, it took 1 step sideways. Not much, maybe 6 inches of space, but it was enough to see more of the human's prone form, enough to signal that maybe, just maybe, negotiation was possible. "That's it," Melthar breathed. "Good. Now we're getting somewhere." He gestured for the medical team to prepare. They were about to attempt the galaxy's first medical procedure conducted with the explicit permission of predator cubs who couldn't technically give consent, but were apparently going to anyway. Administrator Vector was going to hate the paperwork on this one. The actual treatment process, Melthar would later report in the most carefully worded incident documentation he'd ever filed, proceeded with unexpected cooperation from all involved parties, including the ones with claws and teeth. The barrier opened with a pneumatic hiss that made every member of the medical team flinch except Melthar, who was too focused on maintaining non-threatening body language to worry about looking professionally calm. The lead cub growled, low and continuous, but held its position in that narrow gap it had created. The other three watched with the intensity of soldiers evaluating enemy troops, which wasn't far from accurate given the circumstances. Melthar moved slowly, keeping his hands visible, making the friend gesture repeatedly like some sort of deranged greeting ritual. Each step took approximately 3 times longer than normal, and the 6-meter distance to the human felt like crossing a continent while being watched by very judgmental, very armed critics. When he finally reached her side, kneeling carefully to avoid any sudden movements that might trigger a protective response, the cubs closed in, not aggressively but deliberately, reforming their defensive perimeter with Melthar now inside it. He was surrounded by 4 apex predators who had apparently decided to allow his presence on a probationary basis, subject to immediate termination if he did anything they didn't approve of. "Right," he muttered, pulling out his medical scanner with movements so slow he looked like he was performing underwater. "Let's make this count." The diagnosis confirmed what the remote readings suggested. Rigelian fever, advanced stage, complicated by the human's typically overactive immune system trying to fight an infection it couldn't recognize. Treatment was straightforward, assuming one had access to the patient and wasn't surrounded by sentient murder machines evaluating every move. He prepared the injection, narrating each step in that same calm tone he'd been using, though whether for the cub's benefit or his own sanity was debatable. Fever reducer first, then the antiviral, then immune support. 3 injections, then she'll start improving. No sudden movements, no pain, just help. Just like I showed you. The lead cub watched him prepare the first injector with an intensity that would have been flattering if it weren't so obviously a threat assessment. When Melthar pressed it against the human's arm, all 4 cubs tensed simultaneously, a coordinated reaction that demonstrated just how synchronized their pack behavior had become. The hiss of the injection. A moment of stillness where Melthar was absolutely certain he was about to discover what Prowler claws felt like from the receiving end. Then nothing. The cubs held position, watching, waiting. 2 more injections followed with slightly less terror, though Melthar's hands still shook enough that he was grateful for auto-targeting medical equipment. The human stirred slightly at the 3rd injection, a soft sound that wasn't quite consciousness but suggested her body was still fighting. The cubs responded immediately, pressing closer to her, their agitation visible in every line of their bodies. "She's going to be fine," Melthar said softly, not sure if he was reassuring the cubs or himself. "The medicine works fast in humans. Too fast, usually. Their metabolism processes everything at speeds that make dosing calculations a nightmare. But in this case, that's good. She'll be better soon." He wasn't lying. Within 10 minutes, the human's temperature began dropping. Her breathing steadied, her color slowly improving from corpse gray to merely severely ill. Within 20, her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused, but definitely conscious. The cubs noticed immediately, their defensive posture melting into something that looked disturbingly like relief. They pressed closer, making soft, chuffing sounds that their species probably didn't usually make, but that clearly meant something in the language they'd developed with their human packmate. The human's hand moved weakly, finding the nearest cub and resting on its head. "Good cubs," she mumbled, her voice rough. "Good pack, kept me safe." Then her unfocused eyes found Melthar, still kneeling within the ring of predators, and confusion crossed her face. "Doctor, how did you—" "I asked permission," Melthar replied, and the absurdity of the statement hit him like a physical force. He'd negotiated with animals. He'd performed emergency medicine surrounded by creatures that could have killed him in seconds. He'd somehow convinced 4 juvenile predators to let him save their adopted human packmate, and it had worked. "They let you in." The human's confusion was giving way to something like wonder. "They actually let you in?" "After I demonstrated that medical procedures weren't threats, showed non-aggression, and basically begged using your training signals, yes, they let me in." Melthar stood slowly, watching the cubs track his movement, but not react aggressively. "You've taught them far more than behavioral commands. They understand context, intent, even rudimentary cause and effect." The human smiled weakly. "Told everyone they were smarter than the assessment suggested. Nobody believed me." "They believe you now," Melthar assured her. "This incident is going to generate enough research papers to fill a small library. Also, possibly new protocols for handling medical emergencies involving humans and their inexplicably bonded predator companions." Administrator Vekthor arrived an hour later, after the human had been moved to a proper medical bay with significantly better monitoring equipment and significantly fewer apex predators. The cubs, naturally, had refused to be separated from her and were currently occupying half the recovery room like furry, clawed security guards. "This," Vekthar announced, staring at the scene through the observation window, "is the most ridiculous medical emergency I've handled in 30 years of station administration." "But successful," Melthar pointed out. "Patient is recovering ahead of projections. The cubs demonstrated remarkable intelligence and emotional capacity, and we've learned valuable information about cross-species bonding that challenges several established theories. We've also learned that humans will apparently inspire loyalty in creatures specifically evolved to be incapable of it, create interspecies pack bonds that shouldn't be theoretically possible, and generate medical emergencies that require negotiating with animals who can't technically negotiate." Vekthar's eye stalks drooped in resignation. This is going into her permanent record with so many flags that future administrators will think it's a fiction. Inside the recovery room, the human slept peacefully, one hand resting on the lead cub curled against her bed. The other 3 maintained watch positions around the room, their eyes tracking medical staff with marginally less hostility now that their packmate was clearly improving. Melthar filed his incident report with meticulous detail, knowing that somewhere in the galactic medical community, someone was going to read about the time a doctor had to ask permission from predator cubs to treat their human and assume it was an elaborate joke. The security footage would prove otherwise, though he suspected it would raise more questions than it answered. The research station returned to its normal routine over the following days, though normal now included periodic updates on the human researcher and her 4 bodyguards, who had apparently decided that their role as protectors was a permanent position rather than a temporary emergency response. Vekthar updated the station protocols to include a new section, Medical Emergencies Involving Humans and Bonded Predator Species. The section was 3 pages long and included phrases like, "attempt communication before sedation," and "assess pack dynamics before intervention." That would have seemed insane 6 months ago. But that was humans for you. They arrived from their death world, befriended creatures that should have eaten them, created family bonds across species barriers that evolution never intended, and somehow made it all work through sheer stubbornness and an apparently limitless capacity for pack bonding with anything that had a face. The galaxy had spent centuries trying to understand humanity's place in the cosmic order, their role among the stars, their contribution to galactic civilization. Perhaps, Melthar reflected while watching the human researcher return to work with 4 extremely large, extremely protective shadows. The answer was simpler than anyone wanted to admit. Humans didn't fit into the established order. They created their own order and somehow convinced predators, professionals, and entire research stations to go along with it. That, more than their death world origin or their impossible durability, was probably their most dangerous characteristic, and the galaxy was just going to have to deal with it.